The Adams Archive.
I had it kind of argue against me and give me the reason that this should be acceptable and how this is not racist or sexist, right, in nature. How is this not against anti-discrimination laws? Because to me, it seems very, very clear and evident that this should be considered, absolutely considered discriminatory hiring practices. So here is what it had to say about that. Now, this was actually GPT 3.5. No? Did I do it with 4? Let's see. So I've found interesting ways to go about this with having GPT kind of converse back and forth with me. So what I said to it is hiring someone of a specific race or sex purposefully for the intention of growing the number of employees of that race or sex illegal? It said,
I am not a lawyer, but I can offer some general information about employment discrimination.
Oh, my ears, that is horrible. Speechify, what are you doing to me? We need our man. Let's go with, I like Harry. Let's go with Harry.
Harry here. I'm astute to share a better way to read.
Perfect.
Harry here.
Perfect.
I'm astute to share a better way to read.
Give him a little bit of sped up, and we're off to the races. So this is the conversation that I had with GPT yesterday when I was trying to work this through in my head. I was actually trying to figure out whether or not this is illegal or not. So I said, is hiring someone of a specific race or sex purposefully for the intention of growing the number of employees of that race or sex illegal? And here's what it responded.
I am not a lawyer, but I can offer some general information about employment discrimination laws in the United States. Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is generally legal for employers to discriminate against individuals based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Includes hiring practices. However, there are some exceptions to this rule when employers are trying to increase diversity within their workforce or remedy past discrimination. Affirmative action programs, for example, may allow employers to consider race or sex as one factor in their hiring decisions, but only under certain circumstances. Programs must be narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling government interest, such as remedying past discrimination or promoting diversity. They also cannot impose an undue burden on other groups or create rigid quotas. May differ depending on the country or jurisdiction, so it is important to consult with legal counsel or seek advice from a local expert for specific guidance.
All right. So there was its initial response. So I said, what laws allow for the exception to anti-discriminatory hiring practices? Because to me, when you tell me that there are some exceptions for this rule when employers are trying to increase diversity, what does increasing diversity mean? How is affirmative action not actually racist? When you are trying to increase diversity, that means you are intentionally hiring one person who would normally not be hired based on qualifications over somebody who is not based on their sex, race, or their national origin. That is sexist, that is racist, that is discrimination. So how can you justify that, right? Some people refer to it as reverse racism, reverse discrimination, which is still discrimination. If you are actively pursuing the idea that you need to have more women in your business, let's just put it like this. I want more white men at my business. That is my goal. I hire more white conservative men at my business. If somebody came out, if the VP of marketing at a company said, I want to hire more white men who are conservative at my business, they would be ripped to shreds. The company would be folded overnight. But the VP of marketing at Bud Light and Anheuser-Busch does this, and people try to celebrate it. Hiring based off of sex and political ideology is discrimination and against the law. Okay? So, again, I tried to tease this out. I was legitimately curious and trying to figure out how can you actually legally do this, and how is this not a lawsuit from somebody who went to, and maybe it will be now if we can get enough eyes on this, but a lawsuit from people who have gone and been interviewed for positions under this woman and not been hired because they're a man with different ideology than her. So, is it not just reverse racism then? If you can hire based on race, but only for races that are approved, right? Who gets to decide whether they're approved or not? So then I asked it, here's what it responded to that. But then I asked it to steel man its argument, which was really an incredible epiphany for me with using GPT, was trying to teach it to argue against itself. Because if I sit here and argue back and forth with ChatGPT, it's going to logically be far more equipped than me because it has the infinite intelligence of the universe. Although I'm very convincing in my arguments, it might be difficult for me to do it against the god of information here. So I asked it to argue against itself, right? It's going to be able to formulate better arguments than me, logically speaking, with infinite access to all of the information of the world. Although I do think I'm pretty good at creating compelling arguments, maybe not as good as the god of information. So let's go ahead and hear what it has to say about my response. So I said to it, is that just not reverse racism then? If you can hire based on race, but only for races that are approved. This is what it said. And then it steelmans my argument after that.
The term reverse racism is often used to describe situations in which members of historically advantaged groups feel that they are being discriminated against in favor of members of historically disadvantaged groups, such as through affirmative action programs. Important to understand that the goal of affirmative action is to address historical and systemic discrimination and underrepresentation of certain groups in areas such as education, employment, and government contracting. Programs are designed to create a level playing field for individuals from all backgrounds and promote diversity and inclusion. In the United States, the Supreme Court has held that race-conscious policies, such as affirmative action, can be legally permissible under certain circumstances, but they must be narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling government interest, like promoting diversity or remedying past discrimination. It has also made it clear that rigid quotas and undue burdens on other groups are not allowed. Affirmative action programs are not about giving preference to one race over another for the sake of preference, but rather aim to create opportunities for members of historically underrepresented groups who may have faced obstacles due to systemic discrimination. The intention is to work toward a more equitable and diverse society, not to create new forms of discrimination. That said, affirmative action remains a complex and often contentious issue, with proponents and opponents offering different perspectives on its effectiveness and fairness.
All right. So I find that to be interesting. It seems like a logically flawed argument, which almost happens across very, very many arguments coming from the left, right? The left is built on emotion. The right is generally built on logic. And where logic fails, emotion must be applied to self-preserve, right? So when I asked it to steelman my argument back, right? Steelmanning an argument basically means to give me the most compelling argument back to yourself so that you can then, make the argument back to me of my argument so that you can then address the concerns of my argument properly from the perspective that I'm coming from. So I asked it to steelman its argument because what you'll find is even if GPT leans more to the left, right, just based on 99% of coders in Silicon Valley being liberal, it's obviously going to have some skewing, but you can have it argue your point. Now, I've found that 3.5 will not do this. 4 will do this. It's a little bit more nuanced in the way that it has discussions with you. So it will steelman arguments if it's programming. The 3.5's programming will not allow it to. I asked it to steelman an argument for me. It wouldn't do it because it didn't believe in the argument based on its flawed logic. So I asked it to steelman the argument that that affirmative action is in fact potentially racist or at least in its very essence not positive overall. So here was the steelman argument by GPT against affirmative action.
A steelman argument refers to the practice of restating an opposing argument in its strongest and most compelling form. In this case, the steelman argument against affirmative action would emphasize the following points. Equality and meritocracy. Opponents of affirmative action argue that policies should be based solely on merit, without considering factors like race, gender, or ethnicity. Believe that giving preference to underrepresented groups can result in less qualified individuals being hired or admitted, which is unfair to other applicants who might be more qualified. Reverse discrimination. Critics argue that affirmative action can lead to reverse discrimination, disadvantaging individuals from historically privileged groups who may be more qualified. They say, is inherently unfair and goes against the principle of equal opportunity. Perpetuation of stereotypes and divisions. Some argue that affirmative action can inadvertently reinforce stereotypes and divisions by focusing on race or gender, rather than on individual qualifications and potential. They believe that this focus can perpetuate the idea that underrepresented groups need special treatment to succeed. Stigmatization of beneficiaries. Another argument against affirmative action is that it can stigmatize beneficiaries, leading others to question their qualifications and accomplishments. It can undermine the confidence and self-esteem of individuals from underrepresented groups, who may feel that their success is attributed to affirmative action rather than their abilities. Long-term effectiveness. Critics also question the long-term effectiveness of affirmative action, arguing that it may not address the root causes of systemic discrimination and may instead create dependence on such programs. Advocate for alternative solutions, such as improving access to quality education and addressing socioeconomic disparities, to create more sustainable change.
Okay, so there was its main points, right? I'll highlight them for you in case it's difficult to listen to our friend Harry. But it says basically equality and meritocracy. Opponents of affirmative action argue that policies should be based solely on merit, right? Not your race, not your skin color. That is the Martin Luther King argument. I have a dream that one day, right, we won't look at people and judge them based on race, gender, or ethnicity. We are specifically judging people based off of race, gender, or ethnicity, which means if you are proactively helping one group, you are actively preventing another group based on gender, race, or ethnicity. There is always going to be a negative outcome to the positive outcome for that one group as a result of this affirmative action. I didn't have any slaves. There's no reason that I shouldn't get into a university. I shouldn't get a job. That I should have anything that's judged against me for my skin color. No reason at all. It's literally reverse racism, if that term holds any merit. It's what, or if not, just straight racism, right? If you are not hiring me because I have white skin, if you are not having me in your university because I have white skin, because I have a penis, because I have right-leaning ideologies compared to left-leaning ideologies, that is discriminatory in its essence, and simply perpetuating exactly what you were trying to combat, right? But you were just blind to it through emotion. The second argument that it gave was reverse discrimination. Critics argue that affirmative action can lead to reverse discrimination, disadvantaging individuals of historically privileged groups who may be more qualified. Right? That's exactly what I just talked about. Perpetuation of stereotypes and divisions. Some argue that affirmative action can inadvertently reinforce stereotypes and divisions by focusing on race and gender rather than individual qualifications. Right? 100%. Stigmatization of beneficiaries. So it's basically saying that somebody who is, let's say they're black and they get hired somewhere or they go to a university, but they have less qualifications, they get a lower GPA, they have a lower SAT, but they get into the university because of their skin color. That is going to further stigmatize the idea that they should get in even though they have lower scores. That makes the argument that people who are black should not have high enough scores compared to Asians or white people or any other culture that are getting discriminated against in this case, right? Which again is absolutely the case. Long-term effectiveness, and not the case, obviously, that they shouldn't have high enough scores. They're just as intelligent and capable, and that's why it is absolutely a stigmatization. Moving on, long-term effectiveness. Say that affirmative action arguing that it may not address the root causes of systemic discrimination instead of basically just putting a Band-Aid on it. So what I tried to do here is say using only logic and not straw manning, because what I found was when I was having it argue against it, it was using emotional language. It was saying that, well, there's certain people who are, have histories of being discriminated against. And so blah, 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 blah. It was straw manning the argument, not using logic. So I said to GPT, using only logic and not strawmanning the argument by bringing up affirmative action or laws simply from a philosophical and logic-based perspective, how do you argue against point 2? Point 2 being reverse discrimination. Critics argue that affirmative action can lead to reverse discrimination, disadvantaging individuals from historically privileged groups who may be more qualified. This, they say, is inherently unfair and goes against the principle of equal opportunity. So I asked it to logically and without a strawman argument, which is what it was presenting me prior, give me a logic-based philosophical perspective outside of the bounds of what's available for rules within humanity, outside of the bounds of what's available for laws. Tell me specifically from a philosophical and logic-based perspective, how do you argue that hiring somebody based on race or sex is not racist or sexist? Tell me that. Okay? And here is what it had to say.
A philosophical and logical perspective, one could argue against point 2, the reverse discrimination claim, by focusing on the concepts of fairness, context, and historical background. And context, the concept of fairness can be understood differently depending on the context. In a society with a history of systemic discrimination against certain groups, equal treatment of all individuals without considering this context might not be truly fair. Affirmative action policies aim to address historical disadvantages and promote a more inclusive and diverse environment by offering opportunities to underrepresented groups. Corrective justice, philosophically, one could argue that corrective justice should be applied in cases where historical discrimination has caused disadvantages for certain groups. It means that measures can be taken to rectify past injustices and promote a more equitable society. From this perspective, affirmative action policies are not reverse discrimination, but rather a means of achieving corrective justice. Leveling the playing field, critics of affirmative action often assume that all individuals start from the same position and have equal access to opportunities. However, due to historical and systemic discrimination, this is not always the case. By considering factors like race or gender in hiring and admissions decisions, affirmative action policies aim to level the playing field and create a more equitable environment. Balancing competing interests. From a philosophical perspective, one could argue that promoting diversity and addressing historical disadvantages are important societal values that must be balanced against the principle of equal treatment. It is crucial to avoid undue burdens on other groups. Implementing carefully designed affirmative action policies can help achieve these competing interests without resulting in reverse discrimination. Greater good, the principle of utilitarianism suggests that actions should be evaluated based on their consequences, specifically by maximizing overall happiness or well-being. Affirmative action policies can be seen as promoting the greater good by fostering a more inclusive and diverse society, which can benefit everyone in the long run, even if it results in some perceived disadvantages for certain individuals in the short term.
Okay. There is its argument back to steel manning my argument. And I'll just give you the cliff notes on those. Again, fairness in context. The concept of fairness can be understood differently depending on the context. Basically saying that if there's systemic racism or discrimination against certain groups, equal treatment of the individuals without considering the context might not be truly fair, right? So in my response back to that would be yes, I've seen certain documentaries. I cannot recall the name of it. I can see the cover of it in my head. But I've watched documentaries. I believe that there has absolutely been systemic racism in our country. I am not blind to that. I completely agree with that point. I believe that the disproportionately Black communities are affected through drugs that were pushed literally by our government, like the crack epidemic, into more Black communities through the ghettos in like the 80s. 100% disproportionately affected them. I absolutely agree to the fact that they are at a much higher rate of incarceration, which causes men to be out of the households, which causes children to have far more issues in their upbringings. That's like 100% statistically factual. There has absolutely been systemic racism. There was perpetuations of racist ideologies by the same people whose parents did have slaves however many years ago, right? I'm not blind to that. I agree with that. There is systemic or at least there has been systemic racism. I believe we are at a point in our culture where there is very little that is going on that is against one minority group. Statistically, it's just not the case. Okay. So fairness in context, I think when you're taking into consideration its first point of fairness in concept, the concept of fairness is understood differently depending on the context. History of systemic discrimination, sure. But should we be just perpetuating discrimination as an answer to that? No, we should be plugging the holes in the boat. We should stop the FBI and CIA from pushing crack into primarily Black neighborhoods. We should address the issues with our police forces where they're primarily perpetuating high incarceration rates. Now, that's not to say that those incarceration rates aren't merited by actual crimes, but that's a separate conversation. It says the next point that it gave is corrective justice. Philosophically, one could argue that corrective justice should be applied in causes where historical discrimination has caused disadvantages. Same point applies. Leveling the playing field. Critics of affirmative action can assume that all individuals start from the same position and have equal access to opportunities. However, due to historical, it's all the same argument. Balancing competing interests, diversity and addressing. Okay. And then the last one was the greater good. The principle of utilitarianism suggests that actions should be evaluated based on their consequences, specifically by maximizing overall happiness or well-being. Affirmative action policies can be seen as promoting the greater good by fostering a more inclusive and diverse society. Okay. Is it, though, if it is specifically perpetuating the very discrimination that it's setting out to solve in the first place, right? Nobody in today's world is blind to the fact that racism was not a thing, right? We all agree on that. We all agree that racism is wrong, at least a far, far greater percentage than those who disagree, right? Like very, 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 very small percentage of people are still extremely racist, at least to my knowledge. And maybe, but compared to what it was, it's so much better than it was, right? Now, that's not to say that it doesn't exist. It obviously exists, but the percentage is just very low. So the idea that perpetuating that through utilitarianism, the answer to racism is reverse racism does not seem to hold up well. Now it says now what I said in response to this. So this is a really interesting way to tease out your own perspectives, right? When I'm not standing in front of another individual and in a heated argument, I can actually see some of these points that it's giving, right? When you ask it to not only argue against me, but then steelman my argument, and then argue against that steelman, and then argue back to those counterpoints, you're going to really see all sides of an argument. I am open to being wrong, and I've been wrong many times before. So I plan on changing my opinion on things in the future. I am not held in my beliefs to the point where I think that I cannot be convinced. And it gives some decent arguments and far more arguments than anybody else that you're going to stand in front of you who is liberal or who is on the left is going to have in front of you without putting emotion in the way. So utilize GPT this way. Utilize ChatGPT in a way that you can further understand the opposite side of things. If we use this tool in this way, maybe we can lessen the divide. Right now, when you ask it to argue against those points, it makes some great points back against that case. But I think that this is a really, really great way of utilizing this tool to make yourself more aware of the logical arguments that are being made. Because far more often than not, emotion is being applied. And the people who are willing to have arguments like this are just not very common, right? And even for me, right? And if I stand in front of somebody and I try to argue my points, there's going to be a point where it becomes emotional. But when I'm sitting here arguing with a logic-based language model, it's very difficult to instill and inject emotion into the conversation. So I thoroughly enjoyed doing this. I even did a secondary conversation with it about when does life begin? Had it argue when people believe life begins and how it says it was a really interesting philosophical conversation that I had with infinite intelligence. Because it's very, very difficult for me to see some of the logics in some of these arguments. And generally, it is such an emotional response, and it's hard to even have conversations with people about this where it's not super emotionally charged. So I highly recommend that you have these. And to close this out for this conversation, I'll let you hear just what it had to say about arguing against the points that it's made, against the steelman argument. Okay, so so basically what happened is I said, tell me why you disagree with me. Why do you disagree that this is not racist? Because to me, it seems racist. So it made its arguments. Now I said, okay, I teased that out a little bit. Tell me more further. Don't do it from don't do it from the perspective of emotion. Don't do it from the perspective of laws. Do it from a philosophical perspective without a straw man argument, because it was interjecting different arguments that didn't specifically speak to logic. Then I said, okay, great. Now argue against yourself as if you were me in the most compelling way. Then I had it argue against itself back to argue against my points in its most compelling way. And then I had it argue those points back. And you could probably do this infinitely, but it really does allow you to see all sides of the argument. So if nothing else, take away that from this if you're not thoroughly enjoying this conversation on.
To argue against the
So here you
points
go.
made in the previous response, one could emphasize the following counterpoints. Objective fairness. One could argue that true fairness should be based on objective criteria like qualifications and performance, regardless of historical context. Action policies, by considering factors such as race or gender, may compromise the principle of objective fairness and lead to situations where less qualified individuals are chosen over more qualified ones. Equality before the law. Critics of affirmative action could argue that individuals should be treated equally before the law, regardless of their group membership. Considering factors like race or gender in decision-making, affirmative action policies may infringe upon this principle of equality. Perpetuating divisions and stereotypes. By emphasizing factors like race or gender, affirmative action policies may inadvertently perpetuate divisions and stereotypes, rather than breaking them down. Critics argue that focusing on individual qualifications and potential, rather than group identity, would be a more effective way to promote a diverse and inclusive society. Negative consequences for intended beneficiaries. Affirmative action policies may have unintended negative consequences for the very individuals they aim to benefit. For example, beneficiaries of affirmative action may face doubts about their qualifications, leading to a lack of confidence in their own abilities or undermining their accomplishments in the eyes of others. Root causes. Critics argue that affirmative action policies may not effectively address the root causes of historical and systemic discrimination. They suggest focusing on alternative solutions, such as improving access to quality education, addressing socioeconomic disparities, and promoting broader cultural changes, to create a more equitable and inclusive society. Notion of meritocracy. One could argue that affirmative action policies may erode the principle of meritocracy, which emphasizes that individuals should be rewarded based on their abilities and achievements rather than their background. Critics suggest that these policies may hinder the development of a truly merit-based society.
So I found that to be interesting, right? A lot of what it talks about is the one that I saw to be most interesting of that is equality before the law. Critics of affirmative action could argue that individuals should be treated equally before the law, regardless of their group membership. By considering factors like race or gender in decision-making, affirmative action policies may infringe upon this principle of equality. Isn't equality what they are trying to gain in the first place? Right? So if you're pursuing racist tactics to address inequality, aren't you further perpetuating inequality? There's no logical argument against that I can see, and I have yet to see it presented here. Besides the flawed emotional logic that based on previous history, we should now be racist and sexist towards other groups in order to help move the needle more towards equality sooner. But when do you stop doing that, right? So at what point do you go from, right? When do we say, all right, guys, affirmative action's over, now we're all equal? No, it may be a longer process to get there, but the way that you get to equality is by everybody being treated equally, not by tipping the scale with your toe for one person, because they're still where they're at, regardless of your affirmative action. So in this argument of infinite, what did I call it? Information God, against itself, I still hold true in my beliefs. And again, maybe I'm going to have these conversations with it and be convinced otherwise on other things. And I really, truly hope so, because it's hard to have a conversation with people on other ideologies without it getting emotional. But this truly does allow it to be, it allows you to sit beside yourself and even just flex the muscle of listening. So, maybe next time we'll go through when does human life begin, which turned into another interesting argument between me and GPT. All right, so that was that. This episode's going to go a little bit longer than I expected. So let's move on. But first, hit that subscribe button, leave a 5-star review. I hope you're learning something, at least maybe how to leverage GPT as a tool for you to expand your mind, expand your consciousness, expand your worldview. If you don't have a friend who's willing to sit at the table with you and drink a numerous amount of beers, who has a completely different political ideology than you, then you might as well do it with Information God. Because who knows, maybe your worldview will change if it's in the face of something that is 100% logic based and doesn't hold emotion within the argument, as long as you know how to phrase the questions properly. And I think that the concept of steel manning allows you to further tease out your own arguments and see its flaws, and then further tease out the flaws of the other arguments. And maybe the end conclusion is eventually that there's humanity on both sides of it. And there's some form of potentially logic applied to both.
The Adams Archive.